Chapter 3, Part 5. Generative themes can be located in concentric circles, moving from the general to the particular. The broadest epochal unit, which includes a diversified range of units and subunits, continental, regional, national, and so forth, contains themes of a universal character. I consider the fundamental theme of our epoch to be that of domination, which implies its opposite, the theme of liberation, as the objective to be achieved. It is this tormenting theme which gives our epoch the anthropological character mentioned earlier. In order to achieve humanization, which presupposes the elimination of dehumanizing oppression, it is absolutely necessary to surmount the limit situations in which people are reduced to things. Within the smaller circles, we find themes and limit situations characteristic of societies on the same continent or on different continents, which through these themes and limit situations share historical similarities. For example, underdevelopment, which cannot be understood apart from the relationship of dependency, represents a limit situation characteristic of societies of the Third World. The task implied by this limit situation is to overcome the contradictory relation of these object societies to the metropolitan societies. This task constitutes the untested feasibility for the Third World. Any given society within the broader epochal unit contains, in addition to the universal, continental, or historically similar themes, its own particular themes, its own limit situations. Within yet smaller circles, thematic diversifications can be found within the same society, divided into areas and sub-areas, all of which are related to the societal whole. These constitute epochal subunits. For example, within the same national unit, one can find the contradiction of the coexistence of the non-contemporaneous. Within these subunits, national themes may or may not be perceived in their true significance. They may simply be felt, sometimes not even that. But the non-existence of themes within the subunits is absolutely impossible. The fact that individuals in a certain area do not perceive a generative theme, or perceive it in a distorted way, may only reveal a limit situation of oppression in which people are still submerged. In general, a dominated consciousness which has not yet perceived a limit situation in its totality apprehends only its epiphenomena and transfers to the latter the inhibiting force which is the property of the limit situation. This fact is of great importance for the investigation of generative themes. When people lack a critical understanding of their reality, apprehending it in fragments which they do not perceive as interacting constituent elements of the whole, they cannot truly know that reality. To truly know it, they would have to reverse their starting point. They would need to have a total vision of the context in order subsequently to separate and isolate its constituent elements, and by means of this analysis achieve a clearer perception of the whole. Equally appropriate for the methodology of thematic investigation and for problem-posing education is this effort to present significant dimensions of an individual's contextual reality, the analysis of which will make it possible for him to recognize the interaction of the various components. Meanwhile, the significant dimensions, which in their turn are constituted of parts of an interaction, should be perceived as dimensions of total reality. In this way, a critical analysis of a significant existential dimension makes possible a new critical attitude towards the limit situations. The perception and comprehension of reality are rectified and acquire new depth. When carried out with methodology of conscientical, the investigation of the generative theme contained in the minimum thematic universe, the generative themes in interaction, thus introduces or begins to introduce women and men to a critical form of thinking about their world. In the event, however, that human beings perceive reality as dense, impenetrable, and enveloping, it is indispensable to proceed with the investigation by means of abstraction. This method does not involve reducing the concrete to the abstract, which would signify the negation of its dialectical nature, but rather maintaining both elements as opposites which interrelate dialectically in the act of reflection. This dialectical movement of thought is exemplified perfectly in the analysis of a concrete, existential, coded situation. Its decoding requires moving from the abstract to the concrete. This requires moving from the part to the whole, and then returning to the parts. This in turn requires that the subject recognize himself in the object, the coded concrete existential situation, and recognize the object as a situation in which he finds himself, together with other subjects. If the decoding is well done, this movement of flux and reflux from the abstract to the concrete, which occurs in the analysis of a coded situation, leads to the supersedence of the abstraction by the critical perception of the concrete, which has already ceased to be a dense, impenetrable reality. When an individual is presented with a coded existential situation, a sketch or photograph which leads by abstraction to the concreteness of existential reality, his tendency is to split that coded situation. In this process of decoding, this separation corresponds to the stage we call the description of the situation, and facilitates the discovery of the interaction among the parts of the disjoined whole. This whole, the coded situation, which previously had been only diffusely apprehended, begins to acquire meaning as thought flows back to it from the various dimensions. Since, however, the coding is the representation of an existential situation, the decoder tends to take the step from the representation to the very concrete situation in which and with which she finds herself. It is thus possible to explain conceptually why individuals begin to behave differently with regard to objective reality, once that reality has ceased to look like a blind alley and has taken on its true aspect, a challenge which human beings must meet. In all the stages of decoding, people exteriorize their view of the world, and in the way they think about and face the world. Fatalistically, dynamically, or statically, their generative themes may be found. A group which does not concretely express a generative thematics, a fact which might appear to imply the non-existence of themes, is, on the contrary, suggesting a very dramatic theme, the theme of silence. The theme of silence suggests a structure of mutism in face of the overwhelming force of the limit situations. I must re-emphasize that the generative theme cannot be found in people divorced from reality, nor yet in reality divorced from people, much less in a no man's land. It can only be apprehended in the human-world relationship. To investigate the generative theme is to investigate people's thinking about reality, and people's action upon reality, which is their praxis. For precisely this reason, the methodology proposed requires that the investigators and the people who would normally be considered objects of that investigation should act as co-investigators. The more active an attitude men and women take in regard to the exploration of their thematics, the more they deepen their critical awareness of reality and, in spelling out those thematics, take possession of that reality. Some may think it inadvisable to include the people as investigators in the search for their own meaningful thematics. that their intrusive influence, the intrusion of those who are most interested, or ought to be, in their own education, will adulterate the findings and thereby sacrifice the objectivity of the investigation. End of Chapter 3, Part 5.